Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am privileged and honored to open this conference on UN reform. The UN is more than 70 years old, and the world more than 70 years ago was definitely different, very different from the world of today. Global geopolitics has been transformed after a first long period of Cold War, more than 40 years. We had a period of temporary peace after the fall of the Soviet Union, and now a period of geopolitical instability between the US and China, between the US and Russia, and furthermore between the US and the European Union, to mention only these first axes. Geoeconomics has also changed from a post-war global economy dominated by the US to a global economic world split between the US, China, Europe, and others. Parallel to these changes, one may observe that the need for global cooperation is high to be able to respond to the different challenges of globalization. Globalization of financial instability, globalization in terrorism, globalization in the imperative of climate changes. These are only examples of what is going on. There is clearly a demand for an effective global governance. A demand, and this demand makes the UN reform imperative as the title of our conference today. Consequently, the question is how to make the United Nations fit to meet the needs of today's international community. What can be done? What is prepared in practical terms to make the UN meet the challenges ahead? What are the difficulties, the different difficulties of such a reform? To discuss these issues, I am delighted of the presence tonight with us at the University of Geneva of Mr. Michael Moller, our special guest speaker for this event. His introductory speech will be followed by a session of question and answers, open to all the participants here in the room. And I'm also delighted of the presence of ambassadors on the panel, 6 different ambassadors, 6 member states of the United Nations. And also I am delighted of the presence of ambassadors in the room for the discussion that will take place between our speakers and the panel. And these ambassadors will, of course, give us the challenges and their perspectives from a national point of view of the needs and the challenges of these UN reform. With these questions and these issues to be discussed, I am happy and have the pleasure to give the floor to our special guest speaker, Mr. Michael Moller. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you to Professor Kadus and the University of Geneva for hosting us for what I really think is a timely discussion. Our title today is instructive, neither a question nor a query. It reads simply the imperative of UN reform, and rightly so, because much as we debate and dispute other issues, on this one we can all agree, I think. The United Nations now, in its 73rd year, must once again reform. It doesn't work? Can you hear me? Hello? Yes. Okay, I need to be closer. So as I was saying, the United Nations in its 73rd year must once again reform. Reform to adjust to new realities, to address new challenges, and to seize new opportunities. And this is where the questions start. Reform, yes, but how? To what end and why? To serve which or whose ends? So let me today approach these questions from three angles. First, the context of reform, looking at how the world has changed and what that means for the UN. Second, the mechanics of reform, looking at what the UN can and is tangibly doing to adapt. And finally, third, the compass for reform, looking at what the whole exercise is for. So let's first look at the context. Regardless of which point in time you choose to compare today to, the magnitude of change is quite astounding. Whether you go all the way back to the days of the San Francisco Conference that founded the UN in 1945, or whether you just look at the post-Cold War euphoria of the 90s, today's international relations seem radically different. For better or worse, I should add, for recognizing these differences does not by itself imply a value judgment. It's first of all a recognition of reality. The settlement of the 1940s that created much of what we today consider the tenets of international order was an achievement of design, an accommodation to circumstances, and an adaptation to events. Its establishment coincided with the emergence of the Cold War, the bipolar confrontation of two global superpowers. The Cold War's fault lines were hotly contested, but the geopolitical landscape was otherwise neatly bifurcated into the West's blue states and the East's red states. There was hardly a local conflict that was not a proxy for hegemonic confrontation, hardly an instance where diplomacy did not adhere to the strict logic of bipolarity. Comparing them then and now is instructive because it shines a light on a critical development, and that is the dramatic diffusion of power that we have been witnessing. In 1969, Henry Kissinger could still declare that the axis of history starts in Moscow, goes to Bonn, crosses over to Washington, and then goes to Tokyo. Today, this historical cartography seems totally dated. But it's more than just a proliferation of mid-level states that act increasingly autonomously from the big powers. Rather, power that used to be firmly in the hands of the state has metamorphosed into something much more diffuse, whether it's non-state actors challenging the state's monopoly on violence, or whether it's private corporations evading effective regulation by any one state. Power in international relations is altogether a more complex and more messy affair. One way to think about this change is as a contrast between hierarchy and order versus networks and entropy. Whereas in the past international relations were centralized, with core and periphery, with top-down commands and control, today we live in an age of entanglement. Global politics has been reconfigured. The traditional chessboard of interstate diplomacy may still exist, but it is joined by a new web of networks made up of governments, companies, NGOs, terrorist groups, philanthropists, and countless others, all wielding influence and cooperating or clashing at various points in time and place. And these intricate connections are mirrored by the major existential challenges that we face. Looking at any one of them, escalating climate change, protracted conflicts, migratory movements, rampant inequality, you simply cannot disentangle one from the other. And they are, as I said, very much connected. You cannot, for example, ask people fleeing war or worried about finding enough to eat today to worry about what carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will do to our planet tomorrow. You cannot blame people for questioning the legitimacy of a system in which 8 men own as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity, many of whom survive on less than $1 a day, but because of technology, they know very well how the top 1% lives. Contradictions such as these have given rise to a set of broader paradoxes. The world is more connected, yet societies are becoming more fragmented. Challenges are growing outward while many people are turning inward. Cooperation is the only way to achieve shared success, but many leaders pursue a zero-sum competition that no one can win. All of which produces the greatest contradiction of all. Multilateralism is under fire precisely at the moment when we need it most. Now, Defending multilateralism is not about striving to restore the status quo ante, to go back to the way things were. Because if yesterday's tools are inadequate to tackle today's problems, they will outright fail to fix tomorrow's challenges. But what it is about is saving the very foundations for international cooperation, or call it global solidarity, the norms and rules we agreed to advance our shared interests, and the institutions we established to uphold and promote them. At its most basic, it's about saving the structure that over the past 7 decades has raised standards of living for millions, forged peace in conflict-ridden lands, and ultimately helped avoid a third world war. Progress and peace, that in a nutshell, is what saving multilateralism is about. But to be saved, it needs to change. And much as the United Nations is at the heart of the multilateral order, it must be at the core of the change. Change in terms of structures, mindsets, and ways of doing business. We must adapt to realities. Which brings me to what I call the mechanics of reform, the things the UN is actually doing to change. On this point, let me recall that one of the intellectual founding fathers of the UN, the American diplomat Ralph Bunche, already observed in 1950, and I quote him, "The UN," he said, "exists not merely to preserve the peace, but also to make change, even radical change, possible. The United Nations has no vested interest in the status quo. If it did, it would long ago have outlived its usefulness. After all, many of the changes I just described did not emerge out of a vacuum. They echo transformations of decades past. Take the 1970s, the decade in which I first joined the UN. Back then, international relations already exhibited contradictory patterns. Decolonization's march strengthened a Westphalian system on a worldwide scale, but new patterns of globalization, vast flows of liquidity, migrants, and greenhouse gases were already beginning to undercut the autonomy of the sovereign state. The UN was an important locus of all these developments, both object and subject. It charted their emergence, reflected their ambivalences, and shaped their course. Today, as much as in the 1970s, the institutions of the UN reflect an uneasy hybrid between traditions of great power consensus and traditions of universalism that stress the equality of states. Neither the end of the Cold War nor the ever-accelerating globalization processes have disentangled this tension at the heart of our world body. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of it, its many metamorphoses over the years, the UN has retained its place in the spotlight of international relations. Then as now, believers and detractors vigorously debate the fortunes of an organization they simply find too useful to give up. Partly that is a result of the UN's complex nature. Just 2 decades into its existence, an astute observer already described the UN as a multifaceted and incongruous body where no view permits seeing it whole and in detail at the same time. And that is still true today. And because of its very incongruity, the UN has come to mean different things to different people at different times. And it also has allowed us, within reason and under institutional constraints, to reinvent ourselves as time passed by. This legacy of constant change is a backdrop to the ambitious reform agenda put forward by our new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. Let me just briefly recap the 3 pillars of reform. 1, we are reforming our peace and security architecture to ensure we are stronger in prevention, more agile in mediation, and more effective and cost-effective in peacekeeping operations. This pillar has been approved already by the General Assembly earlier this year and will be rolled out in the beginning of January of this coming year. 2, we are reforming our development system to become much more field-focused, better coordinated, accountable, and impactful. This has also been approved by the General Assembly, but without the necessary budget to fully implement it. A recurrent story, unfortunately, in our Assembly. That said, we, or rather our Deputy Secretary General and our colleagues, have secured enough extra budgetary funding to get started with this reform also in the beginning of January. That means that 129 resident coordinator will be installed in as many countries with a skeletal staff, about 3 to 5 people, and with marching orders to get started. And the third reform pillar, to underpin all of these measures, we are implementing sweeping management reforms, or trying to. And the intention is to simplify procedures, decentralize decisions with greater transparency, efficiency, and delegation of authority, and greater accountability. A transversal effort that is a top priority for the Secretary General, and one in which he has achieved tremendous progress so early on, is our drive for gender equality. Today, for the first time in the United Nations history, there is full parity in our senior management group and among resident coordinators leading country teams around the world, which demonstrates that reform in areas within the competence of the Secretary General are easier to realize than those reforms that require the approval of member states sometimes. That gets me to the compass. All these different reforms strands reinforce each other, and they are all grounded in unifying principles. So the third and last part of what I wanted to talk about is the compass for reform. And that compass is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Much like a compass, the 2030 Agenda shows us where we want to go, towards a world free of poverty, towards a fairer world, and towards a world that respects the limits of nature. And the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are helping us to get there. Think about it in terms of the three imperatives that lie at the heart of this 2030 Agenda. One, the imperative of prevention. The SDGs teach us to take the long-term view, to look beyond and to look deeper, beyond the latest headline-grabbing crisis and deeper into the root causes of conflict. Focusing our efforts on prevention is cost-effective, sustainable, and smart, but above all, it will save lives. Two, the imperative of integration and horizontal cooperation. The SDGs are universal and indivisible, with progress towards one goal driving progress in all the others. This indivisibility means that to achieve the SDGs, we ourselves must break down silos and overcome internal and institutional barriers towards truly collective efforts. And three, the imperative of diversity and leaving no one behind. We always say the SDGs are everyone's responsibility. Behind this demand lies the insight that I outlined before, namely that states are no longer the only game in town. To achieve the SDGs, we need everyone, from the private sector to civil society, from seasoned practitioners to youth advocates, to get involved. For the UN, this means that we must ensure everyone has a seat at the decision-making table. If these imperatives sound a bit abstract, just look at what is happening right here in Geneva. There is a real mindset change towards collaboration taking hold in ways I've never seen before. Every day we see new partnerships forming. We see innovations that bring into reach goals that would have only yesterday appeared utopian. All of which is to say that we have a unique but fast-closing window of opportunity to effect real and meaningful progress in the lives of every person on this planet. And more than that, we have, with the reforms and the 2030 Agenda, set the UN on course to seize these opportunities. But we're clearly not there yet. What's missing isn't the means, nor the capacity, nor the ambition. What is missing sometimes is the political will. And there's something else that is absolutely critical, and it's about everyone here in this room today: individual responsibility and action. Looking around this room, at the young in particular, there's no question we're handing you a pretty messy world, and we're placing a huge responsibility on your shoulders. Think about it. You, the young generation, are the first generation that can end extreme poverty, but you are also the absolute last generation that can curb climate change. And it's true, we tend to speak more about the challenges we face, but that's partly because it's easier to map out the big problem than the thousands of individual actions that will constitute the solution. Here, we're all betting on you, on your commitment, your creativity, and your courage to take charge and to take ownership and to be part of the solution and not to sit on the sidelines. Kofi Annan, who really was the ultimate optimist, used to dismiss the point that you are the leaders of tomorrow, because what you really ought to be are the change makers of today. And right he was. So let me close with this appeal. Trust that your actions will have consequences, and trust and that your efforts will make a difference, because they will. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this excellent introduction and speech, and on the current reforms and the hopes in the youth here in the room and in everybody's responsibility. I would like to open the floor for questions, remarks, observation. If you can just present yourself before asking your question, and we will collect 2 or 3 at a whole and then make a first and a second round.
Okay.
Who would like to start? I see somebody at the very, very end.
Last row.
Last row. If you can just stand up as well. Just a second, we will have a micro. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Mujde, I'm Iranian.
Can you speak up?
One of the former MEIG graduate.
Okay, now?
Just speak into the mic closer, so I couldn't hear you.
One, two. Thank you very much, Mr. Moller. I am Mujde, I'm Iranian, but working in the International Relations Department of CERN. I have a question. I admire your speech. I wanted to know that we have the context of war now, as you said in your lecture about the context and exercise. We have the war in Yemen, and we are facing a famine in this country. I want to know that what is the action of reform that you're talking about regarding the famine attacking the country by Saudi Arabia, and why the international community is so silent toward this, what's happening of the blockade in Yemen. Thank you very much.
Maybe you want to collect 1 or 2 questions?
Yeah.
We will collect 2 other questions.
Hi, I'm Walid. I'm just a student here at University of Geneva. But I wanted to ask a question, basically. So a lot of what we hear about at the UN has to do with problems like poverty, gender inequality, education. But we didn't really hear a lot about the root causes. So how would you see the UN reforms kind of addressing those and pretty much addressing the systematic issues that we're dealing with in the world? So an issue like poverty is caused by a lot of things, but there's also systematic structures in the world that are causing these things, like accumulation of wealth, our economic systems, how we manage certain things, inequalities, dictatorships, all of these things contribute to an issue like poverty. So how is the UN addressing those systematic issues, since it's an organization that basically works within the international system that is already kind of damaged in a bit? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moller. We know each other. I'm Marat Shagorsky, journalist, and you're a great optimist, great speaker. You have very good ideas. Now, there are things you cannot master, which is all the conflicts. And actually, in Syria, for example, Mr. Mistura cannot do anything. He'll resign, right? Now, there's something even more important and dangerous that we see. I mean, before there used to be 2 blocks. Well, now we see the emergence of a certain, how to say, KGB era back in Russia, where Mr. Putin, and he said like 2 weeks ago in Valdai that, well, he clearly let know that he's ready to attack, to fight at least, using nuclear weapons. It's not the first time he said that. Donald Trump is not an angel either. Plus, the fight against poverty was helped, a lot helped by the globalization. We see now what happens between US, China, and the WTO rounds are not really advancing.
The what are not advancing?
WTO rounds, right? they're blocked. So there's Uruguay, is it still over? I don't count them, but I mean, anyway, which will not help, of course, fighting against poverty. I mean, it's not enough UN with its budget, and with most people being based, actually, unfortunately, not on the field, but here in Geneva or New York or in Vienna, whatever, which costs a lot. In the maintenance costs, I mean, maintenance costs are very high. So what UN, well, is doing or can do, and I believe it should do much more to preserve peace, to try to calm down all the heat which is now going on. Well, you cannot do anything. There are internal problems, right, which are very high in the States. We saw it 2 days ago when there was attack against the synagogue, and then Mr. Trump was not very welcome. And a prominent journalist in New York said that he made more radicals than ISIS. She retracted herself, but still. I mean, you see what's happening inside the countries. Europe is being more or less dismantled, not entirely, but not many people. I mean, there's Brexit. Not many people believe now in this whole idea of the union. And of course, well, Switzerland is always on the side where we have a very good outlook from here. But, you know, I've traveled quite a lot. It's not so brilliant, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Would you please?
To every
Fine,
optimist,
yeah.
there's a pessimist.
No, I'm not. I want to be. I try to be a realist, but I want to be an optimist.
Yeah.
I'll
Yes,
get
please.
back to you in a second.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. On Yemen, I have exactly the same questions as you do. It's an abomination what's happening in that country. But it brings me to an answer, a sort of more generic answer that also touches on what our colleague said, which is you have to remember that the UN is at least two different things. When we talk about UN reform, we also talk about different things. UN reform, as I have described it, is a UN reform of the structure, of the secretariat, of the UN family of organizations. The other UN reform, which is the part of the UN which is populated by member states, with the Security Council at its head, is a different story. And those are two different kinds of reform that normally should go hand in hand, but where they are out of sync right now, because on the Security Council side and other structural elements where member states are, we're not seeing much movement, or as much movement as we ought to. So, whereas we can, as a secretariat and with the Secretary General, prepare ourselves to be much more effective in meeting the huge challenges of our time, whether it's climate or migration or wars or epidemics, etc. It comes back to what I said before. We have the means, we have the knowledge, we have the human capital, we even have the money globally. But we don't have the required political will to actually give us the mandates and the wherewithal to do it. And that's where you come in. You're all voted for these people, or for many of them. Vote them out and vote somebody else in. Or what more important today, and what we're seeing more and more, and that comes back to something that you said about what's happening in a number of countries, is that the voice of civil society is beginning to grow tremendously and exponentially. And the importance of other actors at the decision-making table, whether it's activists, whether it's students, whether it's a business community, whether it's academia, whether it's NGOs, whether it's press, is becoming more and more important. The time of the governance structures where the state is the only actor is over. And it's over also asymmetrically. In some countries, the state has a much greater impact, and the state will never disappear completely, but it will have to cohabitate with other decision makers that are going to have to work in a kind of polycentric governance structure. We are in between chairs now, and where the old system is still there, alive and kicking, a little on the defensive, and the new system is not defined yet and certainly not legitimized yet. And that's a problem. And whenever we are in these kinds of situations historically, nonsense happens. And I dare say that what we're living right now is massive nonsense. Specifically on Yemen, you know, the Secretary General, all the humanitarian actors, the Secretary General's representative is doing on Yemen is doing whatever he can to get to a political solution. And in the meantime, we're trying to alleviate the suffering to the extent that we can, with food deliveries, with medical help, with all sorts of other activities. It's not ideal. It was not ideal and still isn't ideal in Syria. It's certainly not ideal in Libya, or in Central African Republic, or in Mali, or in South Sudan. It's a mess. And part of the mess is because we are not, and certainly the Security Council is not living up to its mandate or its role to the extent that it ought to in this very fraught situation. That's just a reality we have to live with, and we have to adapt to it, and this is what we're trying to do. The gentleman that talked about root causes, actually, that's what I was talking about. How we are addressing the root causes of the problem is something that, a little bit kind of counterintuitively, 3 years ago, member states signed unanimously this 2030 Agenda for Reform for Sustainable Development. If we manage to implement that by 2030 in its entirety, most of the problems we're talking about now will have been solved, or at least addressed in a massive way. A lot of if you read it carefully, and if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to do so. These 17 goals and all their targets, 169 targets, are really a roadmap, a global roadmap for addressing all of these root causes in a completely different way than we have in the past in terms of development aid, in a much more integrated, much more collective way, where addressing one issue has to be seen in the overall context of all the other issues. There are three very simple but very powerful principles that underline these goals. One is that they're indivisible and interconnected. One is that we leave no one behind, which is surprising enough a fairly new concept. Until not that long ago, certainly if you spoke to your friends in the north, poverty was something that was happening down the road in developing countries. This tells us that there's agreement globally that poverty is something that happens in every single country. When I open a newspaper and see that there are 800,000 people in Switzerland that live below the poverty line, it's a little surprising, but it's a fact. And especially in a country that most of us conceive of as a rather rich country. And the third one is that it's everybody's responsibility. This is not something that you leave up to your governments and then you call them on Christmas morning to find out how they're doing. It's everybody's responsibility, and that is also a completely different kind of approach to development, and to really getting to the problems that are the root causes of our problems today. Now, I beg one? Yeah, I'm getting to the pessimist in a second. But it's a bridge, what I'm going to say to you as well, because one of the things that we always forget, or most of us forget, is that the system that we're talking about reforming was created 70 years ago, has given a level of well-being and has put the human race at a place that it has never been before in its history. We have never been as well off. We have never been as healthy. We have never been as educated. We have never died less in wars or in any other ways, in spite of what you read in the papers. The human race today has never had it so good. We tend to forget that, and it doesn't mean, what it does do is put in relief to a much larger extent what we stand to lose if we don't get our act together. But the fact is that the system as we have it has done absolutely extraordinary stuff for us. And this is not just the UN, it's the UN at the corner, at the center of an international system that is made up of a lot of different actors, other international organizations, other civil society organizations, and certainly governments. But it's an incredible achievement of humankind, what has happened in the last 70 years. And this is worth remembering when we look at what's happening now. Was it you with nuclear weapons? Yes, okay. So this is...
Well, you can Security Council.
Well, Security Council, I mean, I think I've said enough. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we have...
The vetoes, right?
Yeah, but, you know, this goes beyond that. We have talking about reform, by the way, and by restructuring, we have a system that was built 70 years ago in a totally different geopolitical reality, and we have a council that simply is not up to date and capable of really addressing. I mean, its structure makes no sense, and its voting patterns make no sense. I mean, it's just something that was created in a very different era. The problem, of course, is that it was made by states for states, so to change it, you have to have the okay by those you're changing. And it's counterintuitive, but it has to happen. We've been talking about Security Council reform for 25 years or more. It has been a totally, utterly sterile discussion that has led absolutely nowhere. So we really need to start thinking outside the box here and find other ways and other structures. And I think, you know, reality has an ability to impose itself sooner rather than later on everybody, including on this problem. And if we really want to regain the trust in the system, of all our citizens across the world, we might as well start with the Security Council, because if we don't change that, it's not going to happen. So that's one aspect, and this the aspect of the political will that I was talking about before. But it's, as I said, part of the saving grace and part of the optimism is found in these SDGs, to me, actually, because they really have had this extraordinary transformative and federating power, particularly in this town that is very much an operational town and a technical place, where we can find some hope and some optimism. But also the increasing voice of civil society. You were talking about some countries now walking away from the compacts on migration and refugees, or walking away from the Paris Climate Agreement, or walking away from all sorts of stuff that is at the bedrock. Disarmament treaties, etc. I mean, just in general, international law and the rules and the arrangements that we have worked on so hard for the last 70 years to manage our planet. We are going to have to reinvent, and we have to come back to a moment where standards, values, and law is back at the center of how we manage our planet. Because if we don't, it's going to be chaos. It's at least in my mind. This business of walking away and thinking you can do it on your own is going to be a short-lived phenomenon, I hope. But it's very much part of the reflexes of the nonsense I was referring to before.
But it means it's a distrust towards.
Of course, there's huge distrust. We have a massive trust deficit. And the only way we're going to be able to get that trust back is by doing this reform, by showing that we are actually effective in implementing and bringing the needs and addressing the needs of our citizens in every country. It doesn't matter which one. And we can do it. We have the expertise, we have the experience, we have the human capital. And as I said, we have a lot of money on this planet that is lying around idle, and that needs to be directed in the right places. It's not a money issue. So this is, so let me also address through what I said before, your assertion that this is an expensive place that is just doing maintenance work. I couldn't disagree with you more. When we talk about the UN, especially when journalists talk about the UN, we hear about Syria, we hear about Ebola, we hear about migrants here and there, we hear about climate change to some extent, and that's about it, more or less. When I first came here, I used an iceberg as an image to explain that, where the top 10% is pretty much what we hear about and what we're told about. And the rest, the 90%, is all the stuff that we do every day that nobody hears about, nobody talks about, but that has an extraordinary impact on the lives of people. Your life, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, is affected, without you even realizing it, by stuff that happens right in this town. And if it wasn't being done in terms of norms, in terms of standards, in terms of vaccinating your kids, or also, I mean, we can talk for hours about the examples that I have. Your life would be a lot worse off. Your personal life would be a lot worse off, and mine, by the way. Everybody's in this room, and this is why it's really we have an incredible imperative to make sure that we regain that trust. Because if we don't, we will lose what is, in my mind, which is an incredible tool that we have built over these 7 decades. To ensure that we continue to provide the services and the well-being to our kids and their kids. If we close the UN tomorrow, I guarantee you that the day after we would have to reinvent something similar, because I don't think that the world today is able to function without a system, a kind of neutral table around which everybody can come together and agree on the rules, on the way forward, on how we're going to manage ourselves, and how we are going to do it together. Because all you have to do is look at climate change and the challenge that this is bringing, and the latest reports we're receiving. If we don't address that in a collective way, it's not going to happen. And then all the rest doesn't really matter, because we won't be there.
Yeah.
Well, I believe COP is not part of the UN, as far as...
Everything is part of the UN. And COP is part of everybody.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think nobody wants to go back to a state-to-state relationship. In fact, the need is so high for negotiation, mediation, and resolving crises all together in cooperation way. So probably, as you just mentioned it, if it's not the UN, it will be something else. So there is clearly a need for reforming the UN
which may
to
be
get
fine.
some more trust. Yeah,
When actually we're seeing it in the disarmament. We're talking about disarmament. A lot of the, we have, one of my jobs is to be Secretary General of the Conference of Disarmament. It hasn't done a thing for 22 years. Frankly, we need to do it. It's really urgent that we do disarmament, particularly as concerns new technologies and artificial intelligence. And if we can't get our act together, then somebody else should do it. I don't really care, as long as somebody does it.
There's some nice villas actually for the summer ambassador. Italian has a good one near Chateau de Pont.
Maybe it's going to be for rent soon. You can move in.
Would you accept to have another
sure. Yeah,
round of questions? Yes,
come.
please. Nadia.
Good evening. Thank you. My name is Nadia. I'm a student of MEIG program, actually current edition. And I was very excited to listen to the different reforms that are planned, and actually, as I learned just today, that they are approved and are about to be implemented. We learn a lot about the fact that with the world becoming more and more multilateral, with UN becoming more and more multi-stakeholder, like 193 countries, a lot of different agencies, a lot of members that want to have a say, it's becoming more and more difficult to agree on things with such a large amount of members. At the same time, you mentioned that there is a lot that is planned to be done in the decentralization. And it also is expected to be more effective than it used to be or than it is today. So how does decentralization of UN agencies and powers going to help make system more effective? If you maybe could elaborate a little bit on, more on that, and whether it's actually going to mobilize the decision making, particularly maybe you can also speak about the disarmament and the new technologies within the disarmament, because it's becoming quite scary for people living around the world, including myself. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's some plenty down there.
Yeah. These are only questions from the young people.
Hi.
Which is good.
Is that on? Hi, my name's Elsa. I'm also a student here at the University of Geneva. So I just have a very brief but kind of big question. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that multilateralism is sort of, it's not being used as much as it should, especially now in this time of need. And it's sort of a question that's similar to Nadia's question, but how can the UN do more to sort of convince states of the importance of multilateralism, and how can also maybe the Secretary General Guterres do more to convince states that it is important, that we should be doing more diplomacy and not less?
Okay. One more question, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Bouak Arsi. Student here at the University of Geneva, doing the Master of International.
Can you speak into the mic a bit?
Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Keep your mic.
I'm a student at the University of Geneva. I'm doing the Master of International and European Law. I just came from New York for a 4-month internship at the UN at DPKO, and I even saw you there a couple of days ago. Mm-hmm. I have 3 questions, I think. The first one is, personally, I think there are more expectations on the UN regarding, among the 3 pillars, regarding the human rights and peace and security pillars. These 2, I think there are more expectations on these 2 pillars. How do you think now the UN and especially the UN reform, especially on the A4P, how can it practically make the difference? How can the A4P, the action for peacekeeping, how can it make the difference as a new reform? I think just launched on the last March, and this is my first question. The second one is, do you think that reforming the Security Council should be part of this UN reform. And my third question is, having served more than, I guess, 30 years at the UN, how do you see the tomorrow's UN? Thank you.
How do I see what?
The UN of the tomorrow's UN, the UN of the future, the future of the UN. Thank you.
Maybe one more question here, just Katalin.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Natalia, and I'm from the current edition of MEIG. And I have a question.
Speak into the mic.
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned that there are two UNs. One UN is Secretariat, and another UN is a group of member states. And you were speaking about the reforming of the UN, which is represented by Secretariat. But can this reform be effective if we do not reform simultaneously the part of UN which is represented by member states? And in this regard, I would like to ask, is there a demand from the member states for the reform? How ambitious can we be?
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll take some.
No, that's it.
Yeah.
What time? Yeah, no, because otherwise I forget what people say. Sorry, already. Nadia? Okay. No, yes, today, if you go to New York and go into the General Assembly, you will find it very hard to find any agreement on anything, unfortunately. I just had the visit this week, or we all had the visit of the President of the General Assembly, and she was despairing because we have reached a stage now where it's hard to get agreement even on things that have been agreed to for several decades. Having said that, 3 years ago, the world agreed on a climate change agreement, on the reform, the 2030 Agenda for Development Reform, on financing of development, on how to deal with cities, have smarter cities. 4 massive agreements that form this extraordinary global roadmap that we have now. Against the odds, a lot of people didn't think that Paris would go through because they changed the way that we negotiated, and it's a different story. So it's not that we can't find agreements. There is a difficulty to finding political agreements right now, but we can find all sorts of agreements elsewhere, which is, I come back to the fact that there are all sorts of other actors that are coming into the game now and who are coming up with solutions to the problems that are facing us. And the more the political disagreements continue, the more those alternative solutions or solutions by alternative providers are going to have an impact. When the United States, the President of the United States left the climate agreement, within a minute, governors, mayors, individuals, businesses said, we don't agree, we are still part of it. You have one individual, Mr. Bloomberg, who actually pays the contingent of the United States to the Secretariat of the Climate stuff. One man out of his pocket. Things that we haven't seen before, reflexes that we haven't seen before, that are being operationalized into the sort of bloodstream of how we run our affairs. I mean, there's many other examples, and we're seeing this in many other countries. So it's not that white and black, the picture. It's much more gray. Decentralization. Remind me?
Yes, basically in the context of the fact that there are so many stakeholders, and it's becoming more and more difficult to get agreement, how is decentralization going to help make decision-making more effective?
Yes.
Particularly in disarmament and new technologies management.
No, I remember. So you have to make a distinction between decentralization and integration. Decentralization in the context of our reform is much more a matter of empowering the managers, of taking the decision-making much closer to the action, to make sure that we are more effective, that we are better, that we are using our tools and our resources in a more impactful way, and that there's a greater amount of accountability. But in terms of the framework in which all of us are going to be doing this, we are working in a very different kind of way. We are changing the way we work every day in a way that we haven't done in a long time, and that change is a much greater integration, much greater collaboration, breaking down of silos, a kind of matrix management that reflects and is linked to the way we look at the SDGs, for example, where everything is interconnected. You cannot talk about health without talking about the other 16 goals, because if you don't do so in a holistic way, collected way, you're not going to be as impactful. And this is the same way that we're seeing things changing now. Here, the networked approach to work, the readiness to actually go out and collaborate with somebody that you 3 weeks ago didn't even know existed, to leverage your own projects. We are seeing now more and more every day in the UN system, to an extent, as I said before, that I've never seen before. And that you're seeing, that extends further. It's not just a question of what's happening within the UN, it's also a question of what's happening between us and other international organizations, between us and the business community, between us and the NGO community. All of these actors are changing their way of thinking, their way of acting, and their way, more importantly, of interacting and collaborating. This is all in the making, and we are figuring out how this is going to be the roots of that are going to be set. But the fact is that it's happening very fast, and it's having already quite a lot of impact. And we are walking our talk, if you want, also here, where we are very, very, very keen, and we do a lot of work to make sure that we take all of these actors into account when we plan what the way ahead is and what kind of projects we want to support. So we don't have the time to go into a lot of examples, but we have increasing number of examples of where that is happening to great effect. The disarmament agenda, the disarmament issue. The Secretary General has just, and this linked to what I was just saying to you now, just a few weeks ago here, actually. Wasn't it? Yes, it was in this university. Made public his agenda for disarmament. An agenda very different from what we've had before, because he takes disarmament out of its box and places it in a much bigger context. So it's disarmament to be better at prevention, it's disarmament to save lives, it's disarmament that's linked to our development efforts. It's a different way of looking at disarmament, which makes the conversation a lot richer and much more interesting, because it brings in actors, other actors. And that was immediately reflected in how we work and how we are trying to change the discussion and the narrative in the context of disarmament. So very recently I invited the business community, those who sit in Silicon Valley and invent all of these artificial intelligence tools that potentially one day can be used as weapons, experts, academics that we hadn't talked to before, the civil society elements that are not the traditional disarmament NGOs, and member states, into a conversation that suddenly became incredibly rich and much more interesting, and with really some very cool things that came out of it, insights by a lot of people who hadn't thought of looking at these things that way from all sides. And this is exactly what this is about what this reform is about, of really leveraging the many different kinds of knowledge and expertise and activities that didn't speak to each other before, and putting them around the same table to get some solutions that really make sense and have a greater impact. So we're working hard on that. The importance of multilateralism. Where are you? Yes. Multilateralism is not just diplomacy. That was what I got from what you said. Multilateralism is everything that we do to make this planet a better place to live on for all of us, in a collective way. Multilateralism is using the UN system in an optimal way that delivers this well-being that we have been mandated to deliver to our citizens, and that we are at a time now when things are changing, when we are seeing that the old rules don't really work anymore. But so we have to sit down and come up with new rules. We've done it before, in some cases with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But a world that is as interconnected and that is as impacted by massive sort of global existential problems like climate change and others simply cannot be managed in any way other than in a collective kind of global solidarity way. How we craft that is what we're talking about now and what we're living right now. But the principle of it, as far as I'm concerned, is indisputable, because if we don't figure out a way of doing it together, I don't think we'll make it. It's as simple as that. So the imperative of multilateralism, you can call it something else. If there's too many negative connotations with the word because we've been using it for the past 70 years, then let's invent another word. I don't care. One I just said now, global, sort of global solidarity, a different kind. But it's the essence of it that is important.
Thank you.
Wait a minute.
Tomorrow, maybe?
No, we were talking about the expectations on peace and security of the young man who was in New York recently. The intention of the peace and security pillar reform was to make us more effective on the ground with our peacekeeping operations. I hope we'll make it. A lot of people depend on us making that, but it requires a different kind of compact, a much stronger compact between us and our member states. We can no longer have a peacekeeping operation that is mandated by the Security Council, sent out to a really bad place where there basically in most cases is no peace to keep, but where they're asked to do peace without the required tools to do so. And we see it time and time again, where the tools of the trade, helicopters, guns, whatever, cars, when we are under-resourced and under-equipped time and time again. It doesn't work. But the way we are built, it's very hard for a Secretary General to tell the member states, actually, I'm not going to do it unless you give me the resources that is needed. That the system is not built like that. But we really need to rethink. And I think that some time ago, some of you may remember, there was a big commission that was headed by Mr. Lakhdar Brahimi, on how peacekeeping should be reformed. And he came up with quite a lot of good ideas, some of which are incorporated into this reform that we're looking at now. Whether the Security Council reform should be part of the UN reform, quite clearly, they may be. I may have spoken about two UNs, but it's two UNs in the same package, and unless we have a structure through which the member states and whatever other actors are going to be telling us what our mandates are and how we're going to finance it and how we're going to do it and the priorities that we're given, because we are, at the end of the day, a membership organization where the membership is in charge, and we have a system that works and that people trust and can accept and will be ready to fund through taxes and through, then it won't work. So the trust deficit is going to be reduced or eliminated by making sure that all of the structures, whether those that are populated by states or those that are populated by bureaucrats, work as effectively as possible. You asked for the future of the UN. What kind of UN we see in the future? I see a networked organization, a sort of matrix management. By matrix management, I see much greater integration and coordination between the different agencies and organizations. We are over 40 organizations in the UN. There's a lot of overlap. That's one thing that will be taken care of. But more importantly, I come back again to the imperative of having an integrated manner in which we're approaching all of the problems of the world, and we do that through the SDGs. In order to do that, we have to work together, which is what's happening now. But the structures themselves are still very siloed, and they will have to change somehow. They will have to be part of the reform over the next few years to make sure that we do things differently. We have 3 or 4 organizations that do humanitarian work. We have, if not more, we have 3 or 4 organizations that do development work. Really? Is it necessary? Can't we figure out a better structure to manage that? And if we do so in a smart way, won't we have a better use of the money in a more impactful and in a less fragmented way? So I see this a very different kind of a kind of structure, just like I see a very different kind of Security Council. But if I start on that, I'll probably get fired. So I think
Better not.
The demand for reform is universal. It's very clear. I think that first and foremost by member states, they want our system to reform. They want to make sure that their money is used in the best possible way. But there are enough members and permanent representatives in here. You should ask them whether they want a reform or not. I think the answer will be yes. The trick is to make sure that we all agree on what reform we're going to end up with. And I think that we are on the way. It's not exactly rocket science. It's just a matter of marrying the needs and the objectives that we all agree on with both the money and the political will to make it happen. So the imperative for reform is just that, an imperative that everybody, I think, subscribes to.
Thank you very much. And with these words, we will close the first part of the conference. And thank you again for this wonderful discussion. Thank you. May I invite the ambassadors to join here the panel for discussion. As we get chairs, as soon as we can get the chairs back. Here we are, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to resume our discussions. The present panel discussion will be moderated by Ambassador Walter Giger, former Swiss ambassador here in Geneva. I have the pleasure to give him the floor and to moderate this discussion with our special guest this afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Kadu. Welcome to all of you. We heard from Director General that there are two UNs. In my view, there is only one UN. The Secretariat has to serve the membership organizations. And I'm very proud that we have so many prominent representatives of the member states. I propose that I invite one after the other just to make a short statement. I hope that we'll have afterwards opportunity for a discussion. The shorter the panelists are, the more time we will have for discussion. May I start? Well, I'm impressed with the panel. I'm not a gender champion here in Geneva. Therefore, I would like to follow another procedure and first invite the ladies to take the floor. May I first ask the Ambassador of Brazil. The Ambassador of Brazil, Madame Maria Nazareth Acevedo. I think you are the dean of the community here.
Oh, God.
Because if my notes are correct, you served first time in Geneva in 1999.
Yes.
2 terms as ambassador. You also were general consul here. You had very important functions at home and also in Washington. Of course, Brazil, I'm tempted, and I'm retired ambassador, so I say what I want to say. Does the new government has any influence on the position of Brazil regarding the UN reforms? Ambassador, you have the floor.
Well, I'll try to answer your question. The new government is not in power yet. We've heard what the candidate said during the campaign. And we all know that there is a space of the rhetoric of campaign and the action of governing itself. So the UN is a very important chunk of our foreign policy. Brazil has always been a supporter of multilateral rules. Why? Because within multilateral rules, we are equal. We can argue equally around the table of negotiation. So I don't believe this will change. And I'll leave this situation here. Regarding the UN reform, We've been very supportive, as I said. But I want to be provocative here. The UN reform speaks about country residents, speaks about peace and security, speaks about administrative things. What about human rights? We are in the capital of human rights. Where is the space for human rights in this reform? The Secretary General has come to Geneva a few years ago, soon after he took office. And he spoke about prevention of human rights. And we really heard him and we liked what he said, because prevention is what one of you addressed in the questions to Michael Moller. It's about the root causes. It's about acting before things happen or acting before the crisis. So I believe that when we speak about the resident coordinator, maybe he will have a very important role in preventing human rights violations. Why? Human rights is everywhere, from the right to speak and express, but also the right to live, the right to drink safe water, etc. So it's everywhere. So we need not only the human rights High Commissioner on Human Rights or the office working on human rights, but the whole system of the UN. So I believe that this reform will open new doors, new perspectives for preventing human rights. I'll leave it at that, and I'll answer those questions later.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would like now to turn to another ambassador, lady ambassador from Africa. I'm very happy that as ambassador of Botswana, or as a permanent representative of Botswana here in Geneva, has accepted to come. And when I was reading her CV, I was even more impressed. She was Attorney General. So she came from another career to this diplomatic life. And Ambassador, I think it would be very interesting if you could explain us what were your impressions when you came to UN, and then what are your proposals for reform? Please, Ambassador Molokome.
Do you have to press anything, or is it on? These things don't usually like women, if you don't.
I think it's on.
Thank you very much, moderator, and good evening, everybody. Thank you very much to Professor Kadus for the invitation. I don't know if DG Moller is still here. No. If he is, well, even if he's not, I just want to acknowledge the fact that he gave us this fantastic background that set the context for what we can discuss today, this evening. We have a very short time, and I think he did us quite well by laying the context and also explaining what the reforms actually are. Yes, I was Attorney General of Botswana for 11 years. I'm not new to the UN. I'm new perhaps to diplomacy, so forgive me maybe if I say certain things that don't quite go down well. But being on a campus, I thought I should also tell you that I've taught at university. It was actually my first job. I taught law at the University of Botswana, and so I love coming to campuses. It's the main reason I agreed to come here tonight, and I'm very happy to be speaking in front of young people who clearly have an interest in making sure that the world becomes a better place. I think that DG Moller has already said that this whole UN reform discussion is not new. It's been with us for a long time. But maybe what I can say, even before I go to saying to you how I found Geneva, is that coming from Africa, in particular coming from Southern Africa, which was the last bastion of colonialism and imperialism and racism, for me it is very, very important that we remember that the UN was started at a time when many of us were under colonial rule, some very repressive regimes that we experienced, and that therefore the original idea of the UN and how the UN would look we were not part of that discussion, so we had to play a lot of catch-up, as is the case with other regions, I think in Asia and so on, who were also under colonial rule. Be that as it may, Botswana is committed, fully committed to the multilateral system, even more so, as DJ Moller reminded us, now that there are serious threats to its very existence. My background in the legal sphere taught me of the importance of rules. As my sister ambassador from Brazil said, Brazil is committed, as is Botswana, to a system of rules, and that without the rules with which to play the game is going to get messy. We have the game is messy now, even though we have the rules. So in my view, we do need the rules, and as far as I'm concerned, we may be a small country and a small player in terms of population, resources, and influence, but as she also said, we're equals. This is the good thing about clubs. When you're a member of a club, we created the UN as a club. And so I enter the Geneva landscape, Mr. Moderator, as somebody who believes deeply on behalf of my country and who's committed to the whole multilateral agenda. I think Geneva is an exciting place. I am even more encouraged and optimistic being in Geneva, because Geneva has this ecosystem of so many different organizations that are doing so many tangible things, whether it's your World Health Organization, your World Intellectual Property Organization, the WTO, and I'm not so pessimistic. I heard you talk about how WTO is stuck. I think that it is a rule-making system. I'm a critic to the WTO as well, and I do believe that we all have a part to play in the club that we created. We cannot leave it to the Secretariat, and I think, in fact, the Secretariat is doing a fantastic job. It's not a perfect job, but the UN, the success of this world in terms of progress and peace is very much dependent on us as the members of the club rising to the occasion and making sure that it moves forward. I'll stop there for now and take questions going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think this is something we can hear quite often here in Geneva. Here in Geneva, we work. In New York, they talk. But I have in this panel here of ambassadors somebody who did an excellent work in New York. I would like to present shortly the ambassador of Costa Rica, the head of the mission of Costa Rica, Ambassador Gomez. She in the last year, received an award. Received the award 2017 Arms Control Person of the Year, together with the colleagues from Austria, Brazil, Ireland, Mexico, New Zealand, and South Africa, for their effort to secure the historic treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And this is, and I think you will develop a little bit on this, because it was quite a innovative approach. You said, if things are blocked in the Security Council, we can do it elsewhere. Please, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I, as my colleague Atalia, I have taught at the university. I enjoy it so much that almost every invitation I get from the university, I say yes, so very enthusiastically. Yes, I will address your question, but before doing so, I want to talk about some things that have been mentioned before, one of them by DG Moller and the other one by my colleague Lele, the ambassador of Brazil. When we talk about UN reform, we have to think about what UN we are reforming and whose responsibility it is to reform that UN. Because the UN has many dimensions. We have talked here about the bureaucratic dimension, which is what is being addressed by the current wave of reforms by the Secretary General. But the UN also, and mostly, and for a country that has relied on this system to live and prosper, the most important dimension of the UN is that of being a regime for planetary coexistence based on rules and norms and based on a charter and legal instruments and a whole machinery to make those rules and norms being complied with. Let's say that from 70 years ago, we have the UN Charter and then the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the later developments in the different fields. And those were complemented today with the Paris Agreement and the Agenda 2030. So that is like the global ethos that we have. And this is what, being the most important aspect or dimension that we think about the UN, it is one of the most important things that is being deconstructed at this moment, because there is a group of players that is withdrawing from that perception of global governance based on rules, based on norms, and based on institutions, and based on cooperation. And this is what and that is not the responsibility of the Secretary General to reform. It is our responsibility to recall what it is about. Then we are also, the UN is also a global parliament in which all peoples of the world come together to address challenges. And this is not being taken care of by the current wave of reforms. There is the President of the General Assembly shared with us the information that she is leading this process of discussion and reflection in New York to talk about the relevance of the General Assembly. But I think I have an idea. I think that the UN is constantly being reformed, not only the bureaucracy, but the other dimensions of the UN reform of the UN are being reformed on an everyday basis. And let us go to one of the aspects that was mentioned by Ambassador Giger: disarmament and nuclear disarmament. We have an institutional apparatus to deal with disarmament. If it is blocked, then this global community took the decision to the General Assembly, and that is where action was taken. So this is, can we say that this is a reform? I think it is a reform. It is not only an innovation, I think it is an institutional reform, because anywhere you see blockage, you have other ways of having this UN apparatus respond. But there is another aspect to finish with this. I would say two aspects. One of them that is not included, and I think is a shortcoming in the current reform, which is which is already addressed by the Ambassador of Brazil, which is the absence of the word human rights. And this is not only worrisome in a moment in which this global ethos of a world built on the respect of human rights is being challenged. It is very worrisome that the UN reform does not acknowledge that. But it is also very worrisome because the reform states that the development pillar and the peace and security pillar should be interconnected, and we should build synergies among them, because there is no peace and security without development. Well, there is no development without human rights. And let us just, and there is no preventive action by the UN without all the preliminary information that Geneva generates about violations of human rights that later on become humanitarian crisis or great conflicts. Let us just, as an example, and here we are at the university, let us look at all the resolutions that were adopted by the Human Rights Council in the 39th session just some weeks ago. And not to mention resolutions in my own region and others that can be more problematic. Let us take one, which is the resolution on Myanmar. It was about 30 years ago that the Rohingya population was stripped of their nationality. And the international community did not do anything. So any single crisis or any single violation of human rights, even if it's political, civil and political rights, which are a very touchy nature here in the UN, even the failure to address that will come back to us in terms of crisis that we cannot handle. I think I would stop there.
Thank you very much. I would like now to invite a representative of a permanent representative who is representing a country having a permanent seat in the Security Council. I'm very happy that Ambassador Sherman is with us and takes over this role, because quite a few people are making the permanent members of the Security Council responsible to block reforms. So I would like to challenge you a little bit. Please, I know there may be one or two journalists here. This is Chatham House. This is not the press conference. I would like that the ambassador speak out very frankly. Please, Ambassador Sherman, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And just to say what a pleasure it is to be here. I too have taught in a university. There's a theme emerging among the panelists here. I used to teach English in a grande école in Paris, but I realized that my talent sadly did not lie in teaching, so I became a diplomat instead, and hopefully I'm a slightly better diplomat than I was a teacher. I might come on to Security Council reform a bit later, because I thought I might be asked about this. And when I asked for some lines to take on this, when I knew I was doing this event, London said to me to say, our views on Security Council reform are well known. I said, that's not going to do it. So I will go into a bit more detail yesterday. I think I had the miscommunication that I was supposed to speak for 10 minutes. So I have a huge and very worthy speech here, which I'm not actually going to read out to you. But I did want to start by just giving the apologies from my permanent representative, Julian Braithwaite, who is in Dubai at the moment for the ITU conference, so very sadly couldn't be here today, but I'm delighted to be here representing him with so many senior permanent representatives here in the room, on the panel and elsewhere. UK is firmly committed to the United Nations, and we see that as the cornerstone of the rules-based international system, and as other colleagues have said already, that is incredibly important that we have that. But every large organisation, particularly one as critical to the world as the UN, needs to continuously reform and modernise its ways of working so that it remains as relevant as possible to the new challenges which keep emerging, and DG Moller spoke about some of those today. And they keep emerging on our planet more rapidly perhaps than ever before, year after year. So the UN has a noble purpose, but we need to make sure it's also fit for purpose. And this is not about making the UN cheaper or about cutting costs. From a UK perspective, it's about us investing our taxpayers' money, and I think we're the second biggest bilateral donor to the UN and the third biggest donor. But we need to invest that money in organisations which really deliver against their targets. It's about making the organisation more modern, less bureaucratic, and better joined up at the headquarters, but also in the field. It's about being efficient, about being effective, and about delivering on its core purpose, so peace and security, human rights, and of course the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And there has to be maximum accountability for resources and for behaviour. So we strongly support the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in his reform agenda. He's made a lot of progress so far in a very short space of time. And the whole membership of the UN is signed up to the significant reforms that he's intending to do. And that's a huge achievement, considering that it's 193 states in the United Nations. So we want to work with everyone to make sure that these reforms can take root. And some of them are going to start to go live on the 1st of January. Implementation isn't going to be straightforward, so we'll need to support the Secretary General as these reforms embed themselves. We have a bit of an acronym in the UK on UN reform. We talk about LEAP, which is because we like acronyms. which stands for leadership, efficiency, accountability, and performance. But I won't go into sort of huge detail about what all those means. Something I did want to talk about before I come on to Security Council, which means a lot to me, and which we had a big conference on in London last week, is the scourge of sexual exploitation and abuse, which, as we know, has occurred under the UN flag, sometimes by peacekeepers, sometimes by civilians. So one thing the UK is doing at the moment is to really encourage the UN to tackle this, to make sure that no one who's supposed to be responsible for looking after the most vulnerable on this planet is taking advantage of them in this way, but also to root out any sexual harassment taking place within United Nations organisations. So we were delighted that we had the summit last week, and a lot of heads of agency were there from the UN, and a lot of really good commitments were made to put systems in place to monitor the behaviour of employees of the UN and other organisations better, so that these dreadful atrocities don't occur anymore. On the Security Council, so journalists, please bear with me. So we are in favour of Security Council reform, and we're on record as saying that we're in favour of Security Council reform. But it is very difficult. So it would, I think, have been very difficult for the current Secretary General to take Security Council reform as part of this other package of reforms and try and deliver them all together, because it would have meant that all the other reforms would have been held up. But we do want an effective UN. We're on record as saying that we support new permanent seats for Japan, Germany, India and Brazil, along with permanent African representation. So that's the UK perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm coming now to another continent, to Asia. And the country which has succeeded very well in Asia is Singapore, and I'm very happy to introduce Ambassador Fo. He is not only representing Singapore here in Geneva, but also in Vienna. So he can compare two duty stations and the efforts on reform in two different duty stations. But what impresses me very much in his curriculum is he was Director General of the Singapore Organization for Technical Cooperation. This means that he is not only a big politician speaking about these big political principles, but he knows also the work on the ground. So please, Ambassador, for what are your views on reform?
I wasn't expecting to answer that question, but first of all, let me thank you for inviting me. And let me declare that, unlike my colleagues here, I'm not a teacher nor a professor in the university. I wanted to say something first about, before I come to your question, about why these UN reforms are important for small countries like Singapore. Because I think if you look at the UN system, I think more than half of the UN membership consists of small countries. And small countries, we don't want a world essentially where might is right. We want to double down on multilateralism in this current context. We want clear framework of rules and norms to ensure predictability and stability, so that without stability and without predictability, we cannot grow our economies and provide jobs. And so which is why we are very supportive of UN reforms to make it more relevant. Mr. Moller has talked about why the changes in the geopolitical landscape warrants the change. I'll just add one more point to say that beyond the changes in geopolitical landscape, why we need to reform and change is because I think right now we are in the midst of the first digital revolution. But free trade has been, in a way, unfairly blamed for the loss of jobs, for middle-class anxiety, when the real phenomenon, as I said, is there's a digital revolution going on. So it's disrupting jobs and industry, causing middle-class anxiety in all countries, including our own. And we think that the UN and multilateral institutions in general should reform themselves to deal with these frontier issues, to make themselves more relevant and to share best practices and solutions together. One example which the UN and the Secretary General is doing is that he has formed this very prominent high-level panel on digital cooperation, co-chaired by Jack Ma and Melinda Gates, with a group of very prominent people. Why am I citing this example? Because I think this is a wonderful example to show that the UN is looking at frontier issues, right? The UN is a state-driven organization, but dealing with these frontier issues, whether it's digital cooperation, whether it's on human rights, or whether it's on pandemics, I think we have talked about there's a common thread that you need multi-stakeholder engagement. So the question is, can the UN make itself more relevant by using its convening power to bring together different parties and different partners to come together to work solutions, not just states, not just between governments. And so I think this is something that we are very supportive of. Coming to reforms in terms of on the ground, in Singapore, we have an axiom that is drilled into us, the public service, is that we always say that policy is implementation and implementation is policy. So I think we are very good, many development agencies, even the UN, we are very good at identifying problems. But are we good enough and are we spending enough time and resources to look for solutions? So I think what I hope to see in the UN reform system is focus on implementation, implementation, implementation. Because I go back to the perspective of small states. If you don't do well in terms of implementation, actually the people who suffer the most are the small states. The developed countries, even if the UN doesn't do so well, they have the means to cope, but it is the small states, small developing island states, landlocked states that will be in a way forced to bear the brunt of reforms which are not implemented well. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm coming now to the representative and ambassador of Belgium. And Ambassador Müller, I do not know how exactly I have to pronounce your name. Moller. Well, you have on the one side to represent your country, but on the other side also the European Union. And I hope you all have observed the composition of our panel. It's not Eurocentric, but Europe certainly has still a role to play. Ambassador Moller, he was, before coming here to Geneva, Deputy of the Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was also permanent representative to NATO and to the Political and Security Committee of the European Union. His career was in Warsaw, former Yugoslavia, Geneva, United Nations, Brussels, and the European Union. Please give us a European perspective on UN reforms.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Well, you said I'm from Belgium, and in Belgium we know a thing or two on reform. We've been going through 6 consecutive constitutional reforms since the 60s, and so what we learn from that, there is not such a thing as a perfect reform. Any reform is a compromise. So we should never expect that all problems, all issues in all their dimensions are going to be solved with only one reform and that all stakeholders are going to be happy. Which brings me to the UN. And I think what I'm going to say is also what the EU thinks of it. But there are a few EU colleagues around here, so they can always correct me if I'm going too far, which sometimes happens. But coming back to UN reform, it is an extremely complex issue. And so compromise is evident. And what is on the table right now, and I think DG Moller mentioned a few aspects of the reforms that are on the table, are absolutely not perfect. And so there are many flaws in them. And what I plan to do is just to hint at one or two of these flaws. The question is, are these flaws of such a nature that in the end, the reform will not lead to any improvement in terms of the United Nations and its member states putting into place outcomes on the ground in order to get, for instance, the SDGs being reached completely. That is what it is about. And so I identified a few flaws, and my colleague from Brazil already mentioned one. When I think of the United Nations Development System reform, which is, for me, the most important part of what is on the table, what has Mr. Guterres has put on the table, because this is about the UN getting in a coherent way into helping member states to implement SDGs and reach the SDGs. And let's not forget, it's the member states that have to do the job. The UN are there to help. While speaking to UN officials, sometimes I get another impression. They have a fantastic narrative and they all want to come and get more money. And then sometimes I think, yes, but are they going to do it? Which is not the case. They are there to help us. It's a responsibility of every single member state. And UN are there in support. But coming back to the flaws, I see in the reform of the development system, I see two flaws. The first one, and I think Moller mentioned it, is about the humanitarian dimension. I think the humanitarian dimension or the humanitarian sector is more or less absent from the UN development sector reform. For a simple reason, there is this theory that lives around in the UN spheres that development and humanitarian are two different things. And there are huge intellectual debates about when development and the humanitarian overlap and should talk to each other, which is a waste of time. What we see is that humanitarian organizations are scrambling for development money and also doing things that can be considered as development stuff. We see development agencies scrambling for humanitarian money. Look at WHO. So this whole discussion for me is totally irrelevant, but the result is that the humanitarian dimension is a bit invisible in the development system reform. If we have the ambition of creating with the UN a mechanism of being coherent and of eliminating overlap and of filling the gaps and of really helping member states in reaching the SDGs, well, then I think we need to pull the humanitarian sector also into the equation. That's the first flaw. The second flaw, and Lele, you mentioned it, it's the absence of human rights and the norm setting. We are all agreed that 90 to 95% of the SDGs are somehow human rights related, or I should say it otherwise. Human rights are present throughout all, let's say 90-95% of the SDGs. And what I miss is a clear suggestion or a clear way in the development system reform of how we are going to integrate that human rights dimension into the system. For me, these are two important flaws. What I do not know is whether with that we have a flaw in the system that is about to be operationalized, that is potentially lethal with respect to getting the outcomes on the ground. That is on the development system. The second one is on the peace and security pillar reform. Well, it's a bit the same. Of course, a lot is going even more than in the first reform. A lot here is going to depend upon what member states do with it, and especially what the UN Security Council does with it. And there I have, of course, looked to my good friend at Lift. But what are the P5 going to do with this is essential. Because one thing is having the info, one thing is to have pre-warning systems, whatever. The other thing is to do something about it. And there often we get very quickly into the UNSC and then the roles of the P5s. But the other flaw is a more important one, and it's again about the role of the Human Rights Council and of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. I don't yet see that role in that context of early warning, early detection, information gathering, prevention, in short. I don't see it enough. So these are other flaws. And then maybe, I don't want to be too negative, but because my country and EU are fully supportive of what Mr. Guterres has put on the table, and we know that it is a compromise, so we know that. And the question is the glass half full or half empty? We consider the glass half full, but it's not full. So now to come back, what I also miss in the whole reform is the connection between the reform of the development system and the connection and with the reform of the peace and security reform. So this is something that should still be looked into it. And then I have a last point. It's about regional organization. So I understand that the Secretary General wants to deal with the matter, the regional dimension of the reform next year. I don't know what he's going to do. This is very much New York, and so we are Geneva. We are more dealing with consequences of reforms that are being decided in New York, unfortunately. But on this regional dimension, look, again, if collectively we want to be successful in the outcomes and to really have changes on the ground and try to get to implement the SDGs, then we have to make sure that the UN globally on the one hand and the regional organizations on the other hand work perfectly together. We have to find a way of collaborating, maybe of division of tasks, whatever, but this is something that also needs to be done. So voila, these are a few remarks, maybe a bit negative. Please do not go out of this room saying that the Belgians consider that this is going to lead nowhere. No, not at all. We think the glass is half full, but there's a lot still to be done. And then what we have agreed upon, are we going to be successful in implementing what we have agreed upon? Well, it depends upon us. It depends upon the civil servants of the UN. And then when you talk with Geneva-based civil servants of the UN, you sense some lassitude, some skepticism, but they have gone through many reforms and they are a bit fed up with reforms. And this might be dangerous because lassitude can put true reforms into jeopardy. But it's about the member states, it's about us. And so what I expect us to do, that is to be very coherent and to, across the boards of all UN agencies, have the same message. Maybe renounce our pet projects, maybe renounce our pet positions, because many countries do have civil servants of their nationality somewhere in an international organization and they want to do everything to keep it. Maybe we should stop with that kind of policy. So I will stop with that. I have 2 pages, but I think it's enough.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think this was a very appropriate and good balance of, and I would like to thank all the ambassadors. You know, Switzerland, you said Belgium went through 6 constitutional reforms. This is the average of constitutional reforms of Switzerland every year. And I just would like to say...
and still you have not yet reached perfection.
No. But you see, we are considered, Switzerland is considered a country of stability, or every year we have several reforms of our constitution. This means reforms and stability are not a contradiction. Perhaps appropriate reforms are the precondition for stability and for stabilizing the multilateral system. I would like now to open the floor to ask questions, or if one or the other ambassador present here would like to add something, he would be most welcome. Who would like to ask the first question? Yes, Ljubljana, right in the... We take also 3 questions together. Please introduce yourself and tell to whom you are addressing the question.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. First, sorry for my English. I'm from Argentina. I'm studying here at UNIGE, International Law. And my question is for the Brazilian ambassador. It's about which specific measures you could set that UN has to take into account to make the reform more in human rights orientated. Like, we all know that our continent is a continent in which we have a very undignity conditions of life every day, like in a very scope speaking. But I want to know, what do you think about that? Like, which specific measures you could say we could take into account to make this more human rights orientated?
Thank you very much. We take 3 questions. There is another question over here.
Good evening to all. Thank you very much for this conference. I am working as a researcher here in the University of Geneva. I have a question for all the panel. So many times we heard that United Nations is what the state wants that United Nations be. So coming back to the reform about the UN Security Council, but I think that many questions were about this. We saw that UN Security Council have failed many times, but at the same time also have achieved to resolve some problems. But what is, in your opinion, that is very nice to hear that UK is in favor of, what is your opinion that the Security Council has to be reformed in the way that to enlarge the membership, or we have to reform the memberships that we can allow to new members according to their commitments to the security to be present in the Security Council? Considering that, if I am not wrong, so in the United Nations, the small countries have more power to pass and vote and to improve many things. So considering that we have different countries for different continents, what is your opinion and what will be your recipe? What are the best formula to change the Security Council? And this is the second question just for the 3 ambassadors that are in the Conference of Disarmament, because also we have here about...
I think we should limit it to 1 question, please.
And what do you think if we can improve about in the last 20 years we didn't have many improvements in disarmament and we still, I don't know in what point we are. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There was another question over here. Yes. What I do is the following. I take quite a few questions and then I give the panel, each panelist, a possibility to answer. Please.
Yes, good evening, Excellence Ambassadors. My name is Emilios. I'm from Greece. I would like to make a question which is regarded with something what Director General said regarding the financing of the SDGs 2030. In some moments, he told that there are a lot of money in our planet. In 2009, the then Prime Minister of Greece, Mr. George Papandreou, probably you know him, when he was elected, told that Greece has a lot of money to make the reforms and so on. Until today, you know that Greece is suffering. And I would like to ask the Ambassador of Belgium, because he's representing even the European Union, how you think the SDGs goals are going to be financed, since in most of the times when from our lecturers, and even when we were at the UN, they told us most of the UN institutions are underfinanced. So this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was another question in the background, and then here, and then we stop and we give the panelists the floor.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Excellency, for all of your presentations. My name is Wilson. I'm a current MEIG student at the University of Geneva, originally from France and China. So my question will be, in the light of the current developments and trends and shifts in the UN, and given that the spotlight is certainly less on the developed world now and more on the South countries, does it make sense, for example, to have agencies such as FAO located in Rome? And secondly, given that SDGs have been emphasized a lot, would it make sense for you to focus a lot more on non-political issues rather than the ones that we could have heard certainly about, especially about, let's say, on Syria or on Burma, for example? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the last question goes here.
Hello everyone. I am Albert from Fair Internship Initiative, and I have one question to everyone here. What is UN reform means for youth and interns, specifically for UN interns, more specifically for UN unpaid interns? Thank you.
Thank you. Did you also have another question? No? Thank you very much for your questions. I would like now to give each ambassador the possibility to answer very shortly. We have started with the ambassador of Brazil. Please start again.
Okay, so I'll address your question first. You know, once one of my bosses in the career told me that incoherence is a privilege of very beautiful women, very rich men, in powerful countries. So the UN is neither of them. So they have to put their act together and think of the interns of the UN. Okay, so on your question there, on specific, I think the issue here is that the human rights system has many mechanisms, and the UN system has many organizations and mechanisms. We have SDGs and we have human rights. They not always intersect when being implemented. So one mechanism of the human rights system are the mandate holders who travel everywhere. They examine situations, they come, they report. But they only report on the negative. I'm sure they can report on something positive, to build on the positive. If you build on the positive, you inspire other good actions, and this will ultimately prevent human rights. On practical terms, how does it work? With the UN reform, if you get the country resident and he's supposed or she supposed to coordinate the actions, maybe they could include in the actions of the UN resident and the organizations present in that country actions and projects that will make a difference in human rights. That's the vision that I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm giving now the floor to the Ambassador of Botswana.
Shall we share? I don't know, this is a little difficult because obviously we all came prepared for this 10-minute presentation, which we didn't make. But your questions are welcome, and I think that I'm not going to comment on all of them, except maybe to add to what my sister ambassador said there about human rights. I think that some of the colleagues here did say that another way of making sure that there's more attention to human rights is to be more explicit about them in the reform. Because one of the things I was going to say in my presentation, if the time had been enough, is to say that you cannot simply say that the peace and security pillar and the development, they include human rights. I think you just need to be a bit more concrete about it, and recognize that human rights, like gender equality, for example, which is a human right in itself, is a cross-cutting issue. And therefore, make sure that even though it's a cross-cutting issue, it should not then disappear or be subsumed into these other categories. It must be mentioned specifically. I think someone asked us about the location, the shift to the south, and I wish it was shifting to the south. I think we are trying to make sure, I think I said at the beginning of my presentation, that there is this legacy really where we in the south are playing catch up. And I wanted to say that one of the inputs I was going to make is that when we negotiate, we discuss UN reforms, we do that from group perspective. So we have, for example, Africa Group and Group of 77. So we try, as countries located in the south, to come up with questions and issues that are more conducive to making a difference on the ground to the lives of people when it comes to poverty, when it comes to basic indicators of health and education, access to safe water. Once again, all those are human rights. So really for me, the thread that runs through everything is human rights in their civil, political, cultural, economic, social, and so on sense. I think that I'll stop it there because I don't think there's so much time to keep going.
Thank you very much, Ambassador of Costa Rica.
Thank you. Just as my colleague from Belgium did, I want to state that the government of Costa Rica has very enthusiastically supported the reform process presented by the Secretary General. But as there are some shortcomings and the glass is, let us say that it's half full, but it is not the comprehensive UN reform. So we have to be careful in knowing what we expect that reform is going to achieve. So the reason why I made this distinction between the UN as a bureaucracy or bureaucratic apparatus and all the rest of the bureaucracy and the UN as a regime is because we do need to have a more efficient bureaucratic apparatus. That's fundamental. But we also need to put the emphasis also on rescuing the UN as a regime for global coexistence and strengthening the norms and the rules and the institutions and the decision-making processes, which should be democratic. Because it is of course, it is the bet of the small nations. It is the only protection for small nations. But at the same time, this system has proven, as DG Moller mentioned, this system has proven to be the very essential basis for human progress. The best that we have, the humanity has seen in history. So it is not only for small nations, it is also for big nations that we have to go back to strengthening this regime, and also be innovative in terms of how we reform those aspects that need to be reformed, like the Security Council. And because there was a specific question asked to all of us, for the case of Costa Rica, we don't believe in more permanent seats for the Security Council. And we do believe that every institution and every institutional arrangement and every agreement has to somewhat reflect the power structure. That is obvious. But then, if we take that as a consideration, then the Security Council should reflect a different power structure than what we have now. And then, of course, we also have the necessity to have the rotating members. I think that could be also a good way to approach the Conference on Disarmament. There is a group of 50-something nations. 65 nations. Costa Rica has been waiting for, I think, maybe 20 years for a new enlargement. But on a personal level, I'm starting to think that maybe that is not a very good idea. We just have to stop waiting to be admitted, and to start thinking about a conference of disarmament that can have rotating or elected membership. And that way you also increase accountability, because then you have to you have to put the new principles into the old regime. So that would be a possibility to make the disarmament progress a little bit. But I think that what happened in 2017 was a real reform of the way in which we discuss disarmament, not only because of the negotiation and adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but also because of the new agenda that has been proposed by the Secretary General, in which for the first time in history brings disarmament together with the rest of the agendas of the international community. And that is responding to a very important challenge that we all have, that especially leaders have, because we need to depart from this generation in which we used to see the reality in a compartmentalized manner. You have a problem, you have work, you have health, you have science and technology, telecommunications, and you create a whole institution to deal with these things. So we have a global governance based on issue-specific organizations, and I think that can no longer go for the 21st century and beyond. We have to look at networks and task forces and other kinds of organizing resources that are not so compartmentalized. But I think the first two attempts to that new way of thinking, which is systematic thinking rather than compartmentalized and simplistic thinking, is both the adoption of the 2030 agenda and the adoption or the presentation of the disarmament agenda by the Secretary General. I think that will be.
Thank you very much. I give now the floor to the Ambassador of UK.
So thank you very much. So just a couple of quick comments on those very interesting and well-informed questions. Just on the role of the Security Council, it's there to stop mass atrocities and crimes against humanity. So we've signed up recently as UK to there's a group called the Accountability, Coherence and Transparency Group, and they've made a declaration calling on all council members not to vote against a credible draft resolution on timely and decisive action to end or prevent the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. So I think that's important. There was a young man over there who asked about sort of locations and so on, and whether there should be shifts, and also the question about interns. I'm going to try and wrap them up in something about management reform. As the ambassador of Costa Rica said, we all want to see greater collaboration across the UN system, both in headquarters and in the field. And that could include rationalization of country and regional offices and UN country teams. So that might lead to perhaps different locations for different offices. We're also very keen to ensure maximum transparency on funding and use of funds and so on, and better delivery, better performance. The UK, in fact, withholds 30% of its core funding to a large number of the UN agencies based on performance. And we've introduced this recently. We're very glad to say that all agencies have passed those criteria, and they've got their full funding, but we do ask the agencies that we fund to meet certain standards on accounting, on human resources, and so on. So you never know if savings are made through rationalization and so on, and maybe there will be more money for interns. The UK does pay its interns here in Geneva. I believe there was a case some years ago where a young New Zealand intern ended up camping somewhere outside the Palais, which caused somewhat of a frisson. So we learnt from that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador of Singapore.
I'll be quite brief. I would address the question from the gentleman at the back, asking about emphasis on SDGs and why focus on non-political, why focus on the political issues, right? A lot of talk has been saying that the three priorities are the three pillars of the UN system are development, human rights, and peace and security. But one way to look at it, instead of looking at it as three pillars of the UN, you can look at it as a helix. All three are intertwined together. So it's not a question of dealing with one issue and focusing less emphasis on the other issues. You need to deal with all three pillars, or in a helical, look at it as a helix where everything is intertwined. And from our perspective, you need stability norms for growth, because without stability, first of all, you will not have opportunities for growth. Without stability, without security, you have other downstream issues, like whether is it foreign fighters or whether they generate irregular migration flows, whether they suck resources which can be used to help other countries, in terms of their development, deal with the downstream effects of all these security issues. So I think you can't do one or the other, but you have to manage it in a holistic manner. The last point I wanted to make was that we've talked about UN reforms, but one other aspect which I think we didn't really address a lot is that actually each of the UN agencies, they are also conducting their own reforms to deal with the challenges that all of us have highlighted. The WHO under Dr. Tedros has done some good work in terms of making the UN, making the WHO more relevant and hopefully more efficient. The ILO, Mr. Guy Ryder, they have started looking at the future of work because of the digital disruption that I was talking about. What does the digital disruption of work mean for workers? What does it mean for unions? What does it mean for employers? So beyond just the UN, but you should look at some of their agencies, and they are doing some important work. But just because they're not in the headlines, it doesn't mean that things are not happening. Even the Undp is doing some very interesting work. They opened, we have a collaboration with Undp. They have this Undp Global Center for Public Sector Excellence in last year in Singapore. This year, they have transformed it to call it the UNDP, it's a mouthful, Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development. Again, it's a forward-looking initiative to help and to support the development of countries to meet and to achieve their SDGs. So I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Ambassadors. Ambassador of Belgium has the floor.
Thank you very much. I briefly go through the different questions on the reform of the Security Council. Look at the European Union. We have an extremely intricate decision-making process that allows in most cases to avoid one country to block decision-making and to avoid that one country is being put with the back to the wall. So there are mechanisms possible and imaginable to find solutions. That's not the problem. The problem is about political will. And it does not only exist in the Security Council. In the ILO, we have in the governing body of the ILO a set of countries that have a permanent seat in the governing body because of some historical reasons. Well, even there, they are not all of them are very eager in lifting this privilege. On disarmament, it's true, and Moller said it, in the conference nothing is happening. But there is life outside the conference. There's some life, and more than some. Over the last 10, 20 years, a few conventions have been negotiated. I'm thinking of Ottawa, the mines, we have the conventional weapons, the clusters, and work is going on in the implementation of these conventions, which is not only talking, but it helps countries to coagulate and to find some kind of consensus on a set of issues. I'm thinking of laws, lethal autonomous weapons. This is a very difficult discussion, but the discussion is taking place. Okay, we're not going to have a result tomorrow, but in the meantime, capitals are thinking about the problematic, and this can help. But Moller is right, of course, in the conference on disarmament, nothing happens. SDG financing, my friend from Greece, okay, money is of course important, but implementation of the SDGs is about more than money. It's also about changing mindsets. It's about governments reorganizing themselves in how they formulate policy, in how they implement policy. it's not necessarily always and everything about big money. But of course, money is important, and I think that, well, the EU, I'm pretty sure that everywhere you look, if you look at the donor situation, I think the EU, which is a combination of the EU Commission and its member states everywhere, the EU is probably the biggest donor. So the EU is probably certainly doing more than its part of the effort. And then I'm looking at the World Bank. I see that the World Bank is developing huge efforts also in that field. And then on the interns, well, I couldn't function without interns. I truly, really, permanently, I have 3 or 4 or 5 interns in my mission. And they are extremely valuable to me, but I also see that we are valuable to them. So they really can draw benefit from it, and it helps them in their future careers. So there is a win-win. Of course, the question of paying them, etc., the question of paying, etc., is another question.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Before giving the floor to Professor Kadu to thank all the panelists, I would like to make 2 remarks. One remark is on interns. A specificity of the MEIG program is that the participants will work 3 months either in an international organization, governmental, non-governmental, but also in a mission. So if one of the present ambassadors says, well, I would be interested to have a participant as trainee in the mission, please contact us, we will help you. Well, this the mission has to decide. Second point, and this is my final remark, what we organized this evening was an example of what Ambassador Kadu and the whole MEIG team would like to make.
Ambassador of the university.
Professor Kadu. What we would like with this program to build a bridge between the university and International Geneva, but also to build a bridge because all these experienced ambassadors and students, participants at the training course. And I hope that you will be joining us for further meeting. We are already planning one on human rights. But now I give the floor, of course, to Professor Kadus to say some words of thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Giger. Thank you first to our panelists for this very rich discussion on the different aspects of the reforms and your perspective as members of the UN, because as we heard, there is the UN Secretariat and the UN states, and there is of course some different perspective and different challenges to be faced in the near future. Thank you for being with us. As Ambassador Giger just mentioned it, we really want to build this bridge between the university and the Geneva International. And thank you for giving us this opportunity tonight, for your presence here on the panel, for the presence of all of you here in the room. And thanks again to DG Moller for having introduced the topic of our conference. Thank you also to our team, MEIG team, for organizing all this. And I will like, with these words, close the event and invite you for a drink just outside this door. Thank you.